Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of GovCon Roundup Live. I'm Carroll Bernard, co-founder of Govology.com, and I'm excited to be back with my fantastic co-host, Mr. Stephen Koprince, aka the Far Whisperer. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that's super important for small businesses in the federal marketplace, and that's counting what matters. We're going to talk about new legislation for small business metrics that's been proposed out there, and also the work that remains. We're going to also explore why accurate, meaningful metrics matter for small businesses trying to succeed in government contracting. And we're going to dig into a couple of bills that Stephen recently posted on his GovCon Roundup newsletter on LinkedIn. And this is some legislation that could help to move the needle in the right direction. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to also take a look at what still needs to be done and how you might be able to make a difference, whether that's engaging with the SBA or speaking with lawmakers. There is an opportunity to help push for changes that can continue to level the playing field. So without further ado, Stephen, I would like to welcome you back to the show. And the good news is that episode 1 was such a success that our network executives gave us the green light to keep going.
Hey, I mean, those executives are kind people. They're generous. Now, I'm excited to be here. Glad our first episode was a hit with the audience and excited to talk about the SBA Small Business Scorecard, some of the metrics that are used for keeping track of the success or lack thereof that the government is having in awarding contract to small businesses and various subcategories of small businesses like your women-owned small business and HubZone and so forth. As anybody knows who's a sports fan, statistics drive performance. We're in a statistics-driven society right now, a metrics-driven society in a lot of different fields. Those of you, the Moneyball era in baseball continues in every sport now. And I think that the SBA scorecard and the statistics, the goals, all those things are not just data points. They are in large part driving the performance of the agencies in trying to meet the overarching policy goal, which is to provide fair opportunities for small businesses to receive a fair proportion of federal government contracts each and every year. Excited to have this conversation about those numbers, why they're important, where they could be improved so that in turn we can improve the performance in certain areas where the government continues to be falling short.
Yeah, awesome, man. The time of this episode couldn't really be better because you just posted the latest update on the SBA's scorecard. What I would like to ask you, if you could do, is for our listeners who really haven't had a chance to maybe read that article that you just posted yesterday on the SBA scorecard, maybe you could give a little bit of a recap on that. And also, how does that relate to what we're going to talk about today, which are two bills specifically, HR 818 and HR 1816. And in fact, these were just two of the bills that you wrote about in your article last month, 8 small business GovCon bills to watch in 2025. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about all 8 within the hour here today. So we decided to focus on this too. So I'll yield to you and let you bring us up to speed.
Fantastic. You don't want to spend the whole afternoon talking about legislation? People would start falling asleep at some point. So we'll limit it to 2 for discussion purposes. Please check out that article where I have a few paragraphs about 8 bills that should be of note to the small business community moving forward. We'll focus on 2 of them today. The U.S. Small Business Administration, SBA, every year publishes what it calls a scorecard. And the scorecard is supposed to be a measure of how well the government is doing in achieving its goals for awarding contracting dollars to small businesses and 4 specific subcategories of small businesses. And those are your small disadvantaged businesses, which include, but are not limited to 8A. That also includes self-certified SDBs. Later, you've got your women-owned small businesses, service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, and HubZone small businesses. And so the scorecard tracks dollars awarded to those businesses as well as percentages of eligible prime contracting dollars. What percentages of those are being awarded to each of those categories, and then comparing them to statutory goals that Congress has developed for each of those categories. For example, you've got a 23% statutory small business goal. SBA will take a look at all the contracts awarded to small businesses and determine whether the percentage exceeded 23%. There are actually 10 total goals. The heaviest weighted goals are the 5 I just mentioned for prime contracting dollars. The same 5 categories the government tracks at the subcontracting level. Now, there are subcontracting goals for each of those categories, and that's another 5 goals. You say, well, the government's not awarding those dollars. No, but through its requirement that large prime contractors or other than small prime contractors adopt subcontracting plans, the government's pushing dollars down the chain toward those companies. So that's being tracked as well, but it's not as weighted as heavily in the SBA scorecard. And then the government tracks the actual number of unique prime contractors that are small businesses. That's only about 10% of the weight of the scorecard goal, though, under SBA's formula. And by the way, this is a formula that SBA has largely developed outside the statute. The statute doesn't provide the level of detail on weighting and such that the SBA has independently developed. So SBA does that, and then it assigns a letter grade to the government. Again, the statute does not require a letter grade. The SBA has done this. And to each participating agency, which is most of your main prime contracting agencies, are assigned a letter grade for their performance over the year. The SBA just yesterday released the annual scorecard for fiscal year 2024. The SBA gave the government an A for its small business achievement. That is not surprising. I've been on my soapbox many times saying the letter grades, it's great inflation, it's easy A's, all this stuff. The SBA has given the government an A every year since 2012. Most of the agencies got an A too. So you may say, well, that's great. But then that means that everything is perfect. In fact, of those 10 goals I mentioned, 5 prime contracting, 5 subcontracting goals, the government hit 6 of them. That means the government failed to meet 40% of the goals. Also, the number of unique prime contractors dropped. It's dropped more than 50% over the last 15 years. That's an annual decline. When you look at the data underneath the scorecard, it's not as rosy as that A makes it appear. And that's one of the reasons why I have repeatedly over the years said, hey, SBA, these A grades are doing a disservice to federal contractors. The headline is, we got an A, we award a lot of money to small businesses, and yet the data is much more mixed. You've got categories of small business like women-owned small business, which the government has not met that goal, but you wouldn't know that just from seeing that they got an A. So, that's where we stand right now. We got this brand new set of data, but it is sort of similar to previous years. And there's some good news, absolutely some good news. The government exceeded the 23% goal by a lot, up to 28.76%, but still missed on its hub zone prime contracting goal, its women-owned prime contracting goal, a couple of subcontracting goals, so forth. So mixed bag. I wasn't going to be named valedictorian if I failed 40% of my classes in my school, but that's kind of the system that we're working on with the SBA scorecard right now.
And then that dovetails into the 2 proposed bills that you wrote about last month. You want to talk about how this can potentially move the needle to change some things. Scorecard metrics are being graded or are taken a look at with regards to the new proposed bill about that woman-owned certification program.
Congress has set out the goals. Those goals are in statute, 23% for small businesses, 5% for women-owned small businesses, and so forth. Each of these 5 categories has a prime contracting goal. There's a couple common misconceptions first about the goals. One common misconception is that the goals are required. It's a required 23% set aside. I've even seen that on the SBA's own website in various places, and that's completely wrong. It's a goal. It's unenforceable. The second misconception is that the goals are about contracts, like the number of contracts awarded to a company. In fact, the prime contracting goals are dollar-based. They're percentage of, as I said, the eligible prime contracting dollars. So one $100 million contract is going to be scored as $100 million toward the goal, not as one contract, and vice versa. A lot of small contracts are not going to be worth as much in the goaling as one large contract, for example. One of the problems I believe exists with respect to the way the score is being calculated and ultimately this A grade achieved every year under the SBA's formula is that prime contracting dollars are given an outsized weight. As of last year, about 57% of the weight of the scorecard was contracting dollars. And why is that potentially a problem? Well, what it means is that, for example, if you have an 8A company that's awarded a $250 million contract, and some of these 8A firms, especially those that may be entity owned by Alaska Native companies or tribes, are capable of winning these giant contracts, that counts as a lot of dollars toward that category, but it doesn't mean that a lot of 8As benefited from that. Only one 8A company benefited from that award. And so there's been a heavy emphasis on the number of dollars awarded to small businesses, but very low emphasis on the number of unique small primes actually engaged in the federal market, actually winning federal government contracts. And as I mentioned earlier, over the last 15 years or so, that number has fallen by about 50%. And that's a dramatic decline. So as the government in the same period has been getting A's almost every year, the number of small primes that are doing business with Uncle Sam is dropped dramatically. It's dropped by 50% or more, dropped again last year by about 0.57%. Not a falling off the cliff drop, but a continued trend of dropping. There are a number of factors associated with that. You can argue this is due to consolidation and GWACs and strategic sourcing. There are a lot of factors that may play into that. One of the factors, getting back to my discussion about how statistics drive performance, is that when the agencies are being evaluated on their small business achievement, they're being evaluated almost entirely on the dollars. And so it doesn't matter to them so much whether they have one 8A with a $250 million contract or 10 8As with a $25 million contract. They get evaluated the same pretty much for that. There's not a lot of emphasis paid to how many small businesses are winning contracts, and there's even no emphasis in the scorecard to bringing new entrants into the market, because it's something that frequently comes up in conversation is how are we encouraging new companies to come in? We're seeing companies exit the government market at the prime level for various reasons. How are we encouraging new companies to come into the marketplace? And so this first bill that I mentioned is called the SPUR Act, HR, and that means House of Representatives Bill 818, the Small Business Procurement and Utilization Reform Act, or SPUR Act, would simply say, okay, SBA, when you're doing this annual scorecard, we require a consideration of the number of small businesses that receive a prime contract for the first time and fit in one of those categories we're talking about, one of those 5 categories. A first-time small business, a first-time hub zone company, a first-time 8A contract for that company. Well, that's a metric that right now is not considered at all in the scorecard. There's no credit given to an agency for saying, this is your first ever hub zone contract. And so we brought somebody into the hub zone marketplace for the first time by awarding them their first hub zone contract. I think it's an important step because it recognizes that dollars are not the end all be all. That if we really want to have a broad base, a broad industrial base of small businesses, we need to be focused not only on the dollars, but on the number of small businesses that are winning these contracts, bringing new entrants into the market and incentivizing agencies to find solutions to bring these new entities in the market and take a chance on a new company who's coming to the market for the first time. This bill has gotten bipartisan support. I don't always post on bills because there are thousands introduced every year. Sometimes I do if it's really relevant and the bill just kind of sitting in committee. But what really gets me excited about a bill is when it looks like it might have a good chance of becoming law. This bill, I think, does. This bill was introduced in the House a few months ago, back in March. Advanced through the House, or maybe even earlier. I think it may have been introduced in January. Earlier this year, February or March, it advanced through the full House on a bipartisan vote. So overwhelming support for this bill in the House of Representatives. And we're not living in a bipartisan era, right? Everyone knows that. We're in a highly partisan era. So finding something that everybody could get behind, or almost everybody, 25 naysayers here, is pretty extraordinary. So you've got a bill that advanced 384 to 25 bipartisan vote through the House, goes over to the Senate, and if the Senate feels the same way, then it's going to be something that's going to be adopted there too, hopefully signed into law by the president, or perhaps rolled into an omnibus bill like the National Defense Authorization Act. This bill does have some support because there is this mindset among policymakers too that we need to draw more entrants into the market. And just focusing on the number of dollars is not going to drive agencies to do that. But if we can change the performance metrics to drive the performance, we can maybe incentivize agencies to want to bring in new entrants to the market. So that's the SPUR.
Yeah. So there was another one, the bill about the elimination of the self-certification for the WOSBs, but there was still some allowability to count the self-certified firms in the goaling program, which skews the numbers. We can go into more detail about self-certification programs and some of the challenges that self-certification poses. But you want to talk real quick about this specific with regards to the bill for WOSBs and what may happen here soon?
Yeah, it's a great bill. Another one that I happen to know, I'm not a lobbyist by any stretch. This is all just my personal opinion.
You should be.
But I support the SPUR Act and WSB Accountability Act. Looking at the scorecard data the SBA just released, it's extraordinary when you dive down to the women-owned small business number, because you look at the government and they say, look, the goal is 5%. We did 4.97%. You say, that's not bad. Like you have 4.97%, you still should be able to get to 5, but we're heading in the right direction. And that's true. The previous year was 4.91. Awarded $31.7 billion to women-owned small businesses. Okay, that all sounds pretty good. How are we doing in terms of women-owned small business set-asides, though? How many contracts are going WOSB set-aside? Because you hear anecdotally women saying, I get the certification, I'm not seeing set-aside contracts out there. Well, the annual scorecard tells you you're not wrong about that, because the percentage of dollars awarded as a result of women-owned small business set-asides is 0.35%. 2.2 billion. Remember, 4.97% was awarded to women-owned small business companies, but only 0.35% came from set-aside contracts. The current system is that to win a WSB set-aside contract, you have to be certified. It's been that way for several years. Congress eliminated WSB self-certification for set-aside contracts. Those 0.35%, you can say, are definitely certified women-owned small businesses. For the government to claim credit toward the 5% goal, the company does not have to be a certified women-owned small business. It can self-certify. And when the government awards a different species of contract, like a small business set-aside contract or an 8A set-aside contract or sole source 8A contract, if the company has checked the woman-owned small business box to self-certify, the government counts that dollar toward the WSB goal. And that is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, we can argue about whether double counting should occur. But more to the point, in my experience, a lot of self-certified companies don't qualify for that status because these are complicated rules about ownership and control. This is not me saying that a lot of companies are trying to defraud the government by self-certifying as WSBs.
Some do.
Some do. I wouldn't say a lot, but there are absolutely some. Fewer, I think, now because you don't get prime contracts for that. You could try to defraud to get a subcontract. But a lot of folks just think they're WSB because the woman owns 51%, and yet they're not meeting the control requirements. You've got a man who's maybe a high officer position or whatever. And so they don't actually qualify, but the government's counting it toward that 5% goal. And that's that huge gap between the WSB set-aside number and the dollars that are being counted toward women-owned small business. This bill, the WSB Accountability Act, would plug that loophole. It would stop the SBA from counting self-certified WSBs toward the 5% goal. If you awarded an 8A contract and the company was a certified woman-owned small business, you could count that toward the WSB goal too. But if the company had just self-certified, you couldn't count it. And so that's what that bill says. It says, SBA, you got to stop counting self-certification toward that 5% goal. I think that if this bill passes, you're going to see a lot more women-owned small business set aside because it's clear to me the government is relying on double count to get to 4.97%. They're not relying on WSB set-aside vehicles. You take out all the self-certified companies, that you got to find more ways to get the dollars to the certified companies. And so this bill was very popular. Folks may know the group Women Impacting Public Policy. They supported this bill on Capitol Hill. You talk about lobbyists, they're better at that than I am, and was advanced by the Small Business Committee in the House unanimously. Again, a bipartisan unanimous vote in committee on the House floor. It was done on a voice vote, which again is akin to unanimous. That means that no one demanded that there be a vote. The chair just says, I hear everybody saying yes. I don't hear anybody saying no. Unless anybody objects, we're going with yes. And nobody said, I object. We got to count the vote. And so it's essentially de facto unanimous. Don't come and say, oh, you said a voice vote means unanimous, but it's sort of without objection, without somebody saying we need to count the votes. So again, strong bipartisan support for this bill in the House. It's now in the Senate. We'll see what the Senate does with the WSB Accountability Act too, which again, as I mentioned, some of these women-owned small business advocacy organizations are in favor of this bill, saying we want to make sure that we have certified WSB companies are what's being counted. That's how we make sure there's integrity in this data, as opposed to just anybody who self-certify regardless of how good their due diligence was or if they were even trying to do some fraud. So yeah, that's the second bill, the WSB Accountability Act.
Yeah. Hey, kudos to WIP. This is going to be a big win. Just like Stephen said, if it didn't register everything that Stephen just said, really where this matters is when these self-certified firms are counted towards those dollars. And even if it says, hey, we met the 5%, now the agencies don't really have that much of a incentive to continue to try to push to get those dollars to meet those goals that were already stated, right?
For the scorecard, for the ones that were dollars actually awarded through WSB set-asides is 0.35%.
Out of
it's 5%
so
goal.
That wouldn't look too good.
No, you wouldn't want 0.35%. And so I think agencies right now are just assuming that we're going to pick up most of our WSB dollars by accident when we award contracts under other vehicles and somebody has that on their SAM profile. And so you take that away, at least for self-certification. Now, how are we going to get above 0.35% or some higher number? Some of the double counting is for certified firms. The way to get there is to start using WSB set-asides more often, which are not being used very much right now.
I wanted to also talk about, Steve, we talked about the 5 major goaling programs, and you got, again, the SDB, Small Disadvantaged Business, you got the SDVOSB, Hub Zone, the WSB, Small Business. So of all of those now, really the only ones that don't have the formal certification, and this is at the national level. So small business, you just put your revenue in and your employees and kind of auto calculates there. And so that's still a self-certification. And Stephen and I have talked about this before, but as long as there's those self-certifications, there's going to be misrepresentation. And like Stephen said, a lot of times it's unintentional, but everybody feels like a disadvantaged business, and probably everybody is to some degree. When you look at the two categories of what qualifies as socially and economically disadvantaged, almost all small businesses can say, I'm economically disadvantaged.
Yep.
And sometimes they read that and it's not socially or economically disadvantaged, but maybe it should be. And maybe more should qualify under the program so that really they could take advantage of the 8A business development program, which is really designed. And I wanted to also talk about a big disadvantage that nobody's really talking about, is that all small businesses start out with in the government marketplace, is a performance and an experience disadvantage. And I think that's what Stephen was alluding to a little bit earlier, which is like, there's stats that show about 80% of the businesses registered in SAM or more never get a government contract. And a lot of those are small businesses. And then of those contracts go to, they're not just small businesses like we are here at Waypoint America and Govology. Sometimes they're $50 million, $100 million, and sometimes way more than that, depending upon what the NAICS code size standard is. So you're seeing a lot of the big dollars going to the same firms and being counted towards the goal. So this is why we wanted to come and talk about this and say these bills are great, but we believe that change can still be made, and we believe that change is still needed out there. We believe that change is needed in the self-certification program like the SDB, because when they report that 5% SDB goal, it's going to be partially just like the WOSB has been. It's going to be a part of it that's not going to be actually to firms that actually meet the regulations and what the regulations define as a small disadvantaged business. And Stephen, I know you and I talked about that before. Don't just tick the box on SDB. Make sure that you're understanding what that means, because you really don't want to misrepresent yourself.
STB is the last one out there that's not just the ordinary small business self-certification, where it's one of these complex ownership control type programs, but you can still self-certify. There's no such thing as an STB set-aside or sole source contract for self-certified companies at the prime contract level, but you can do that for purposes of the goaling and for purposes of subcontracts with large prime contractors under their subcontracting plans. They can take credit for a award to a self-certified STB subcontractor. What do SBA regulations say as an STB? And I've had conversations with people who say, I felt disadvantaged. I clicked the box, or I'm a minority, so I assume that's a minority business program. It's getting less due to court decisions and the current administration's preferences. Neither of those is true. If you look at SBA regulations essentially says self-certified STB must meet all the criteria of an 8A company, except they're not certified. Essentially, it's a self-certified 8A, and that could be somebody SBA. If you're listening, you need to do a better job of explaining how to meet this criteria, because there are criteria in there that, as a former practicing lawyer, made me scared, because I don't know how anyone could actually do it. Like, they would say, if you're in the 8A program, for example, and you want to take outside employment outside the 8A firm, you need to get SBA's permission. In the SDB program, the rule says the 8A rules apply to you. That rule theoretically applies to you, except the SBA is not going to give you permission because you're not a certified SBA. They're going to be like, 8A company, they're going to be like, we don't know what you're talking about. So how would you even make that happen? I don't know. I think SBA needs to flesh out and simplify for folks, if they're going to keep self-certification, how you do that. Because I honestly do not know how you could be 100% sure that you qualify as a self-certified, given the way the rules are currently written. Assuming you did the very best you could and said, there are certain rules I just cannot comply with because they apply only to 8A, you still have a whole list of very complex requirements that you must meet. I don't know anyone who has really dived into those and assured themselves they meet all those criteria. Numbers are pretty striking here too. The government's SDB category in the goaling, well, last year that was $78.3 billion and a 12.127% of eligible dollars that went to the small disadvantaged business category. That includes both 8As and self-certified. So 12.127%, which I count that as meeting the goal. The statutory goal is 5%, but it was a 13% goal under the previous years. You could argue that they didn't meet that goal either. Then think about this. How much of that 12% plus was awarded under 8A set-aside contracts? 4.03%. 4.03% under 8A contracts. And so that means that a large percent, 8% or so of the 12 is really going to self-certified companies, of which, my opinion, a big chunk of those don't actually qualify. A big chunk of those companies don't qualify. And so you've got a real problem with counting all these dollars towards self-certified companies, all these dollars towards self-certified SDBs, when in fact, the only ones that you can be sure actually meet the criteria are the certified 8A. The rest of them maybe do, maybe you don't, depending on how you apply the 8A criteria in a self-certification world. But a lot of them, even giving the benefit of the doubt that, yeah, you don't need the SBA's permission to take outside employment. Okay, you still don't meet this net worth requirement, or you don't meet this ownership division requirement. These rules are the most complex of any of the small business programs. So it's an area where I think there's room for improvement and room to think about, does it make sense for the government to have a goal for self-certified SDBs, or should it just be an 8A goal? That's a policy question that maybe Congress should be looking at.
Do you know if there's a equivalent of WHIP to SDB?
I don't know of an organization specifically like that, but of course there are a lot of veterans organizations out there that do lobbying as part of what they do. You can think of your major vets organizations, and a lot of those have in the past, for example, in the famous Kingdomware case came in and were supporting that. There may well be, and I would love if someone in the comments, but a lot of the veterans organizations have a lobbying arm as well.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of nonprofits out there that support socially disadvantaged businesses. If that's you, my suggestion would be maybe look into who's the leadership over at WIP, Women Impacting Public Policy, get their blueprint. I think there is a push that needs to be made for an equivalent built for the SDB certification. If you just take out those self-certification goals and make it really the 8A certified firms, maybe you do make an SDB certification or something. Stephen, before we wrap up, I wanted to mention the Indian Small Business Economic Enterprise, otherwise known as ISBEE. That one is still self-certification. And I would guess, I don't know, but that's tracked in a different way. It probably would have some similar issues to all the other self-certification programs that are out there as well. I'd like you to comment on that, but also let me get a part two of this question in. If you are a business that has one of these certifications and you're being impacted by self-certified firms that shouldn't be there, what can you do to raise the alarm, to maybe impact policy? I guess there's also the option to protest and police yourself, because I think, and I've told this to small businesses before, you're going to be the best police of your competition to keep them in line, because you guys all need to play by the same rules. And there's not a contracting police out there monitoring all this. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, and I think they just briefly touch on the ISBEE question. We haven't talked about that here. That's an important point. That's another preference program that exists, but the reason it's not included in this annual scorecard and my discussions of these major goals is it's not a government-wide program. It applies to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service. Those are the entities that have the statutory authority to make those types of awards for the ISBEs. A lot of these programs are similar. You've also got, of course, on the DOT side, there's the Department of Transportation's DBE program, which bears some similarities to 8A.
Yeah, what's going on with that one, by the way?
That program is like, we don't need to get too much into that. That's another show. We should actually talk about that as part of another show, because there's court cases challenging aspects of that program as well. So again, that's a separate one that is not wrapped in with this discussion, but it's still another program we should be thinking about as well. So yeah, I would say that's going to ultimately be either Congress or perhaps BIA, IHS could look at those certifications on the ISBEE side. DOT is currently engaged in litigation on that side. That might be a good question for moving forward. With respect to self-policing and that sort of thing, we're in an interesting world now with respect to protests, because it's hard under the protest regime to protest a self-certification of the kind that's causing these problems within the data. And by that I mean that before, when you allowed women-owned small businesses to win WSB contracts as a self-certified companies, you could protest that self-certified company if you lost a contract to them and say they're not eligible. But if you've got a small business set aside and you lose the contract to a company that is a small business and you don't think they're ineligible in that regard, and you notice that they've self-certified as a woman-owned small business, can you protest that? No, because that woman-owned small business wasn't necessary for them to win that contract. They didn't have to check that box to win. There's no prejudice to you in that, right? You could still argue they made a false claim, but I don't think that's going anywhere because the woman-owned small business status was not necessary for them to win that contract. They could have checked no, and they should have been treated no differently if it's a small business set aside than if they checked yes. You've fallen in this legal gray area where you may say they're incorrectly checked the box, we think, but we don't know what to do about it. A formal protest might not do the trick. You send what you have to the agency IG, you send it to the contracting officer, try to get somebody interested in the fact that you think
Are
this
the
company
IGs still employed these days?
who's going to have the time to say, well, I don't know, they didn't get any federal dollars out of it, so what do I care? But ultimately it ends up mattering because they say, well, it doesn't matter, whatever, they could have gotten that contract anyway. Sure, but now those dollars count toward the WSB goal. And that's one more case in which the agency says, oh, good, we got the dollars there. We don't need to do a WSB set aside because we're doing all right on our goal. So these things add up. It's a tricky area to try to challenge as a contractor because of the nature of the problem. The problem isn't that you're losing contracts to these folks on the individual level who are self-certifying, but they're wrong. The fact is that you're maybe losing contracting opportunities because work isn't being set aside. Company after company has potentially improperly certified and is taking credit for those dollars. They don't think they need to do a set aside for your category. Yeah. It's a tricky question. The solution has to come from the policymaker level, from the congressional level, because that's where the problem lies. And it's no longer solvable by individual small businesses. It's solvable by Congress. That's why I think this WSB Accountability Act is important.
As we wrap up this and head into our Q&A session, I'm just thinking, and as you were speaking, Stephen, I just keep thinking we'll continue to watch these bills, and kudos to women impacting public policy. And I think that if this goes through, that's the blueprint. If you care about your certification and you don't want to lose opportunities to firms that are not actually certified, perhaps reach out to the folks at WIP. Ask them what was their blueprint and follow it. And there's a lot of supporting organizations out there, for SDBs, even though we don't know of any like Small Disadvantaged Business Association. Maybe you should set that one up since you got some time on your hands. There's the 8A, and I know that there's the Minority Supplier Development Councils, big national organization, and I know that some of those entities help folks get their 8A certification program. So I think this one would be the call to action for those of you that care about it is really, let's get that last SDB certification or the self-certification not counted towards the goals so the actual certified firms can count it. We take one more step to leveling the playing field, as they always continue to talk about leveling the playing field, but even within that, there's still a lot of work to do. So, Stephen, thank you so much for bringing to light the article. Thank you for the discussion that we had today. We'll look to see an update on those bills. I'll give you the last word before we head out into the Q&A.
That's a good discussion as always. With respect to this issue of self-certification, it's worth noting that the service-disabled veteran-owned small business just switched. There's a bill, Congress did this on the SDVOSB side a couple years ago, and SBA implemented this with a rule in 2024. But the rule took effect October 1st, and those of you who are contractors know what that means, different fiscal year. The data we just had for SDVSB at the subcontracting level did count self-certified companies. Next year's annual report will not. It'll be interesting to see what that does to the SDVSB data next year, and we'll see, of course, I'll continue to keep folks posted on the SPUR Act, the WSB Accountability Act, and other bills if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, as various people do. Only a few of them are fake people. Jamie Dimon, the famous investor, supposedly followed me on LinkedIn. I was like, oh, that's cool, except it was fake Jamie Dimon. There are a lot of fake profiles on LinkedIn these days, but there are a lot of folks who are following me to learn about the government contracting stuff. So I'll continue to post on the goals. I'll continue to post on the bills, and you and I will be back next time. Maybe we'll fit it into 30 minutes. But when I start talking contracting data, I don't know that I can do it.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And we'll end on that. Thank you so much for those of you who joined us today live, for those of you who may be watching this on demand. If you want to join us in the future on a live show and jump in to the Q&A with us, go to govology.com/roundup. Also, I highly encourage you to subscribe to Stephen's newsletter on LinkedIn. That's GovCon Roundup newsletter, and we'll post a link to that for those of you in the chat. You can also easily Google GovCon Roundup newsletter, find, subscribe. Stephen shares some really great updates. I've been following him for years. It's been my go-to way to stay up to date. So hopefully between Stephen's newsletter, I would like to also give a plug for the smallgovcon.com blog, which Stephen had started in his law firm, and that's continuing to go on today by the great folks that he worked with there.
Yeah,
I'm
they
glad
do
they're
great work. And yes, go back into smallgovcon.com. You can see all the updates that they're posting. And if you want to read my ramblings on GovCon from about 2012 through 2021 or so, I've got 1,000 articles plus on that site as well.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.